So some of you will recognize Ganucheau as a New Orleans name. I did grow up in New Orleans through high school, but have lived the rest of my life in Lafayette. This genealogy is my mother's genealogy, the Boudreau line. She was born a Boudreau, and she worked on this for at least 25, 30 years of her life. In the 1980s, I helped her transition from the original personal ancestry file, some of you will remember the Mormon program early on, to Family Tree Maker, and then several subsequent updates to Family Tree Maker. And I've taken on the role of family genealogist for our family, such as it is. I also did the research for my wife, Louise, to join the Daughters of the American Revolution and improve her direct descent from revolutionary patriot Pierre Doucet. So what's a genealogist to do? You know better than me how many records you accumulate over the years, how many images of census files, how many baptismal records and death certificates and marriage records and photographs and draft cards and tombstone photographs. And sooner or later you ask yourself, well, what am I going to do with all this? How am I going to share it? Well, the options that most people choose are one of these three. The simplest option, cover all your bases, is print it all out, the genealogy record of your line, and put it in a 3-ring binder so that somebody has your research. The second option is to print a nice family tree in a frame and give it to your children or your grandchildren so they know their direct ancestors for several generations back. Or if you're really ambitious, you can create a family history and genealogy book and publish that privately or otherwise. Well, I took advantage of a Boudreau family reunion this year in April to share my mother's genealogy with the family. This photo is the reunion participants gathered together for a few announcements and a blessing before lunch. We had about 100 family members in attendance. We met in Washington, Louisiana, at the Wolf Ballroom, an historic mercantile building that's now used as an event center. Our Boudreaux are strung out all over South Louisiana and as far away as Texas, Florida, Minnesota, and Idaho. So why meet in the little town of Washington, Louisiana? Well, Washington was the home of my great-grandparents, Dr. William Ralph Boudreau and Josephine Francois Lalanne. William established his medical practice there in the late 19th century. He also purchased a plot in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Washington. My grandfather later added to that plot with an adjacent plot, and today there are 26 Boudreaux buried at Cedar Hill. The reunion planners were my first cousins, who are now, like it or not, the tribal leaders in our clan. So Boudreaux, these were people born between 1950 and 1976. Boudreau descendants attending the reunion were either great-grandchildren or second or third great-grandchildren of William and Josephine. So having the reunion in Washington had the double benefit of returning us to our family roots and giving everybody an opportunity to visit the cemetery. I wanted to do more than simply lay out the genealogy chart for everybody to see. I wanted to first introduce reunion goers to the family, to learn the stories of those who had preceded them, then move back in time to more distant ancestors. And finally, tell the story of how it is we came to be in South Louisiana. Then they would be ready to look at the genealogy chart and see more than just names and dates of their ancestors. So my plan was to begin with telling the stories of these people that, at least my first cousin cohort, most of them, they knew them, they had known them. So they were people born 1890 or later. I solicited from my cousins 300 to 400 word life stories of their parents, their aunts, their uncles. And two of our first cousins in my cohort have already died, and they were included in this tribute as well. The writers of these stories, I asked them to bring an 8x10 standing photograph of their loved one that they had written a story about, bring it to the reunion. So there were 17 of these on display, and that's the picture that you see here. Let's see. My screen is not moving, Steve. Why is it not moving? Oh, got it. Sorry. Okay. So each of these individuals then had a standing photograph, a life story, and a little blue journal. There were pens on the table, and participants were asked to use the journals to jot down their memories, their favorite memories, or a tribute to these individuals who were on display. This is the photo and the story that I wrote about my grandfather, William Robert Boudreau. He was Dr. Boudreau's eldest child. So at the top of these forms for each story, I had a simple genealogy that I developed in Microsoft Word. And so we have the name of the person, their birth and date of death, their age of death, who their parents were, and who their children were. Sorry, that's that. So that's the very top of the form. Then below that was the story itself. In this case, reunion goers learned this about my grandfather, that he enlisted in the Army during World War I, that he assumed head of household responsibility for his mother and 5 siblings after his father died. He was 26 at the time. And that he was constantly searching for ways to improve his career opportunities. He worked as a mechanic, wholesale grocer, a Shell oil wholesaleman, and finally a Shell district manager. Here are 3 other stories of these people who were on display in the tributes section. Reunion participants learned that my uncle Tom Boudreau served in the Army during the Korean War, then returned and completed an electrical engineering degree, including a thesis on lightning. He worked for Louisiana Power and Light in Gretna for 30 years. My cousin, Linda Wood, became a Dominican sister and served in San Antonio and Guatemala. She became a leader in her religious order, serving as vocation director as well as formation director for the Dominicans. My uncle Bill Boudreau served as a pharmacist mate in the Navy during World War II. After the war, he went to college and graduated from Loyola with degrees in chemistry and biology. He was mechanically inclined and could fix anything. He also built a racing sloop with a friend and would race from New Orleans to Pensacola. There were just so many interesting things we learned about these grown-ups, about whom I and my first cousin previously knew very little, really. I had bigger plans for these wonderful life stories. I've added each one to Family Tree Maker. When an individual is selected in the genealogy, one of the options in the detail panel on the right is called Media Links. This is where you store images of records that you've gathered or photographs. And here I've created a link to the person's life story from the reunion. This is shown here from my grandfather. Clicking the link opens the PDF in a separate window. So the life stories submitted are now an enduring part of our Boudreau genealogy. Many reunion goers took the opportunity to write memories they had of these recent ancestors. Scanned images of these memories and tributes will also be added to these individuals in Family Tree Maker and be available to future generations. This made the reunion not only a time to learn about family history, but to enlarge that history. The second display I prepared was ancestor profiles. Now we moved deeper into our family history. These 12 profiles were of family members born before 1890. I designed the profiles in Canva, an online graphics application, and each profile was printed on 11x17 cardstock at Office Depot. Then I mounted them on a foam board and displayed them on back-to-back tabletop easels at the reunion. Where did I get all this information? First, again, it was my mother's genealogy, and she was meticulous about taking notes of interesting facts about her ancestors as she found them, and she added them into Family Tree Maker, so they were there for me to see. And secondly, she wrote a memoir called Anna Ruth Remembers, and it featured many stories of her ancestors. I designed each ancestor profile according to the same template. The ancestor's name in bold letters is at the top. There's a genealogy link just below the name that shows the person's relation to my first cousin cohort or the generation before ours. The person's occupation or noteworthy fact was next. A photo or silhouette was included. To the right of the story was the person's, to the right of the image was the life story of the person. And at the bottom left or center was a descendant chart, visually connecting this ancestor to the generation above my own. Finally, in some cases, there was sufficient space for a relevant photograph. The image you see here is a barrel halfway made by a cooper under Jean-Raphael Boudrot. The compressed genealogy at the bottom of each one of these profiles starts with the ancestor at the far right. The direct link is highlighted in each successive generation and terminates with either my generation or the prior generation on the far left. I created these little genealogy tables in Microsoft Excel. As you can see here, the row and column format of Excel was perfect for such a simple descendant chart like this. And there were lots of box, line, and shading options that you can customize. The steps on the right show how I saved each of these tables as a JPEG graphic, so I could use it in the overall Canva design. I'm so sorry, I am way behind. This is the Excel screen. Forgive me, raise your hand if I'm not making sense. This is the Excel screen showing how I built this table in Excel using those lines and arrows. But as I said, Excel can't create a graphic image from this. So I saved it as a PDF file, which you can do, and then imported that into a Corel PaintShop Pro, another graphics program, which could easily save it as a JPEG. Then I could drop it into the ancestor profile in Canva. These are the 12 profiles that I came up with. Augustin Remi Boudreau was the first Boudreau of our line in Louisiana. The main genealogy chart starts with him. He fought as a militiaman in the American Revolution under General Galvez. Acadians who settled in Spanish Louisiana were required to join the local Spanish militia. These were located in present-day St. Martinville and Opelousas. These French Acadian settlers, who had been expelled from Nova Scotia by the British some 20 years earlier, were only too happy to join Galvez's force and fight against the British. Dominique Lalanne was the father of Dr. Boudreau's wife and a successful merchant in Washington. Jean Mouton is credited as the founder of Lafayette, having donated the land for the Catholic Church and the parish courthouse there. Ambrose Mouton was a realtor and broker for farm equipment, sugar mills, horses, cows, and carriages. He also served in the Louisiana legislature. Josephine Francois Lalanne, my great-grandmother, was Dr. Boudreau's wife and a mother of 8. She lived a long life, but it was not without tragedy. Her second and third children, Marie Cecilia, 2 years old, and George Joseph, 11 months old, died within 2 days of each other in January 1902. A photo of their little graves is featured on her profile. Auguste Vincent Labbé was a wholesale grocer in Lafayette and another great-grandfather of mine. Marie-Alice Mouton was his wife, and she also had a huge family with 24 grandchildren. Jean-Raphael Boudreau was Dr. Boudreau's father. He was a blacksmith, wheelwright, and cooper in Washington. His blacksmith shop was on Main Street, a block away from our reunion hall. In his day, Washington was a thriving steamboat town when the Bayou Catawba still connected to the Atchafalaya River and thence to the Mississippi. His skills would have been in great demand. Francois Piet was another patriot of the American Revolution. He was in the Opelousas militia, which joined Galvez in the Battle of Baton Rouge. He was of Scottish descent from Nova Scotia. Yes, sir. Oops, sorry. Mary Alice Mouton, Jean-Raphael. You're going to keep me honest. Thank you. Francois Piet. We see a lot of Piets up in Evangeline Parish today. It's a Scottish name. It used to be Peters. The Scots also settled in Nova Scotia, and a lot of them married French wives, and Peters became Piet. He was also in the Battle of Baton Rouge. Jacques Dupré was a Creole of direct French descent and a wealthy cattleman, owning a vast ranch in St. Landry Parish. He served as a major in the Louisiana militia and fought the British in the Battle of New Orleans. As president of the state senate in 1829, Dupré finished the unexpired term of Governor Pierre Doucet. Michel Boudrot is very important to our story. He was the first Boudreau in North America, emigrating to Nova Scotia in the 17th century. You will see the link between Michel and Augustin Remi when we get to the main genealogy chart. And finally, Dr. William Ralph Boudreau was the progenitor of all the Boudreaux at our family reunion. He practiced in Lawtell, Ville Platte, New Iberia, and for the longest time in Washington, Louisiana. He traveled by horse and buggy and often received payment for services in kind. A couple of chickens, a suckling pig, a sweet sack of sweet potatoes. As with the life stories from memories and tributes, these ancestor profiles will also be added to Family Tree Maker. Having explored the Boudreau relatives near and far, it was now time to ask the question, how did we come to be in Louisiana? We have to go back nearly 300 years to answer that question. Just as Great Britain had been colonizing the eastern seaboard of America during the 17th and 18th centuries, the French had been busy colonizing New France to the north. French settlers were drawn to Nova Scotia by the promise of farmland and had been farmers and fishermen for generations by the mid-1700s. It was a remote area, a peninsula in the Atlantic, far from the French stronghold of Quebec. However, it was adjacent to the British colonies and located between those colonies and French Quebec. Britain controlled Nova Scotia when the French and Indian War broke out in 1754. They required the French settlers to sign an oath of allegiance to the king, which they refused to do. What followed was the Great Upheaval, or as the French call it, le grand dérangement. The Great Upheaval display at the Boudreau reunion tells this story. Beginning in 1755, the British, forcibly deported the French from Nova Scotia, fearing that they would take arms against the British and fight with the French. Families were forced to relinquish their property and were loaded onto British ships, bringing only what they could carry with them. Men and women were often on separate ships, and many families were torn apart. This display features a map that describes the deportation of the French Acadians in Nova Scotia by the British during the French and Indian War. The Great Upheaval was 20 years before the American Revolution, when the American colonists were allied with the British against the French, who had settled in present-day Canada. I designed the panel to the left of the map to succinctly tell the story. The Acadians were boarded on British ships and taken to the American colonies on the eastern seaboard, or even farther afield. Between 1755 and 1763, approximately 10,000 Acadians were deported. Many families were separated when ships headed to different ports. Thousands died of disease or starvation in squalid conditions aboard the ships. The American colonists were furious when these disease-ridden French-speaking refugees arrived and did not offer a warm welcome. Although the British did not transport Acadians to Louisiana directly, it was a Spanish possession at the time. Many Acadians did eventually migrate to this region. The Spanish in Louisiana welcomed the Acadian refugees, and word soon spread among the Acadians wandering and searching for a new home. This is how the Boudreaux and many other Acadian families came to settle in Louisiana. The map is divided into 4 sections. The top part, number 1, is called Early Acadia, where the Acadian farmers and fishermen are simply living their lives peacefully and choosing neutrality in the constant conflicts between the British and the French. Number 2 is the deportation, the various routes that the British ships took to the American ports along the coast during the deportation. Number 3, migration and return, subsequent wanderings of Acadians back to France or the West Indies or Louisiana. Some Acadians returned to Nova Scotia after the war. The Spanish in South Louisiana welcomed these refugees, and many French Acadian settlements sprung up. And number 4 is Acadia today. Most Acadians live today in Nova Scotia, France, and Louisiana. They vigorously maintain their language and their cultural heritage. The Evangeline display at the reunion tells the story of the Acadian tragedy through literature. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow heard of the plight of the Acadians and wrote this epic poem about 100 years after the deportation. The poem is nearly 1,400 lines long and became one of his most popular writings. It tells the story of Evangeline and Gabriel, engaged to marry on the eve of the deportation. They are separated and boarded on different ships, and they wander for the rest of their lives looking for each other. I used Canva again to design the Evangeline display and printed the 36-inch by 36-inch graphic at Office Depot. I selected several key passages from the poem on the right side with a summary of the poem's plot on the left side. This stanza from the poem, shown here enlarged, is the British commander's address to the men of Grand Pre, announcing their fate. Painful the task is, I do, which to you I know must be grievous, yet must I bow and obey and deliver the will of our monarch namely that your lands and dwellings and cattle of all kinds forfeited be to the crown, and that you yourselves from this province be transported to other lands. God grant that you may dwell there ever as faithful subjects, a happy and peaceable people. Prisoners now I declare you, for such is His Majesty's pleasure. The 4 pictures in the center of the graphic tell the story in 4 episodes. First, the announcement of the deportation order by the British commander in the church at Grand Pré. Second, the Acadians being rowed out to the ships while their village burns in the background. Third, Evangeline pausing at a cemetery during her wandering and searching for Gabriel. She wonders if perhaps he might be buried in this unmarked grave and longs to be with him. And fourth, her reunion with Gabriel on his deathbed in an almshouse, some years after she became a religious sister. The poem ends with these 2 stanzas. Thus many years she lived as a sister of mercy, frequenting lonely and wretched roofs in the crowded lanes of the city. Wending her quiet way, she entered the door of the almshouse. On the pallet before her was stretched the form of an old man. Long and thin and gray were the locks that shaded his temples. Motionless, senseless, dying he lay, and his spirit exhausted. Whispered a gentle voice, "Gabriel, oh my beloved." Vainly he strove to rise, and Evangeline, kneeling beside him, kissed his dying lips and laid his head on her bosom. And as she pressed once more the lifeless head to her bosom, meekly she bowed her own and murmured, "Father, I thank thee." Well, before long, Evangeline became one of the strongest cultural symbols of the Acadians. The Acadian flags and statues display at the reunion provided a cultural comparison between Acadians living in Nova Scotia and those in Louisiana. Both groups have developed flags to identify themselves and their unique heritage, and both have famous statues of Evangeline, who became a symbol of their suffering and forbearance. I designed this display also in Canva and printed the images at Office Depot. Then I used a standard trifold presentation board to mount the graphic. Both flags feature the French tricolors, and both feature a gold star, a symbol of the Acadian patroness, Our Lady of the Assumption. The flag of Acadia was designed by Father Marcel Francois Richard and adopted in 1884 during the Second National Convention of Acadians on Prince Edward Island. The Acadiana flag was designed by USL professor and Dean of Agriculture, Dr. Thomas Arsenault. It was officially adopted in 1955 for the Louisiana bicentennial commemoration of the Acadiana deportation. There are also famous statues of Evangeline in Grand Pré, Nova Scotia, and St. Martinville, Louisiana. The text under these statues describe how they came to be. In 1988, Abbeville attorney Warren Perrin began a legal proceeding to seek an apology from the British Crown for the deportation of the Acadians in the mid-18th century. 15 years later, Queen Elizabeth II signed a royal proclamation acknowledging the wrongs committed against the Acadians. She established July 28th of each year as a day of commemoration. I call this display the Queen's Apology. A replica of this proclamation was on display at the reunion. It is printed in English on the left and French on the right. Having led my Boudreau cousins through their relatives near and far, and after telling the tragic history of their distant Acadian relatives, it was time to lead them into our Boudreau genealogy. Before reaching the full genealogy chart, they encountered this 4-generation chart that I designed. As I said previously, every Boudreau at the reunion was a descendant of William Ralph Boudreau and Josephine Francois Lalanne. The 36-inch wide chart shows 4 generations of their direct descendants only, down to the level of my first cousins. By including only direct descendants here and using color coding, the different branches of our tree are clearly visible. My hope was to put a face on some of these names and give folks a close-up look at their immediate family tree. My first cousin cohort is at the bottom of this chart. These were the movers and shakers at the reunion. I also marked with crosses the people in this cohort who have already passed away. We now arrive at the full Boudreau genealogy chart. It is 22 feet long and by 24 inches tall. It covers 13 generations from 1601 to present. At the reunion, it was laid across 3 8-foot folding tables. There were forms available on the table to submit any changes or corrections that were needed. The chart is a descendant chart, beginning with Augustin Remi Boudreau, my 5th great-grandfather. He was the first Boudreau in our line, as I said, to settle in Louisiana. The graphic next to his box on the chart gives a relationship between Augustin and his great-grandfather, Michel Boudrot, who was the first Boudreau to settle in North America. He emigrated to Nova Scotia in 1642. The chart itself covers 10 generations, beginning with Augustin Remi. Another graphic at the top right of the chart displays the 3 preceding generations of Acadians, from Michel Boudrot at the right to Augustin Remi Boudreau on the left. This completes the 13 generations, beginning with Michel's birth in France in 1601. Another graphic on the chart, shown here enlarged, is the legend I created. To make it easy for people to follow the direct line from Augustin Remi for the first 6 generations, these individuals are shaded in gray. Direct descendants of the next generation are shaded in yellow, and direct descendants of the following generation, my generation, are shaded in green. These colored boxes make the chart much easier to understand, since only direct descendants have these colored boxes. These are the details on the chart itself. I used Family Tree Maker version 2019. The chart was printed on heavy paper by Ancestry Printing. I uploaded my entire Family Tree Maker database to Ancestry Printing, not just an image of the chart. So the chart was actually printed directly from the application to get the highest quality and to ensure that the output was exactly the same as I had designed. It was shipped to me in a heavy plastic tube with a label describing the name of the chart, the print date, and the Ancestry Printing website. The toolbar shown here is used to customize the chart. The items to include link lets you pick which facts and dates to include in each person's box. This is one factor that determines the size of each box. Of course, you can put pictures if you have pictures. You can put place of birth, place of death, but all that makes those boxes grow. And one of the constraints I was under is I didn't want it to be more than 2 feet wide so that we could lay it out on the table. But I want to point out 3 features in this chart options toolbar that I think really made a difference. Generation labels, insert image, and box and line style. If you click the generation labels checkbox, then these labels print on the left side of the chart. You can see them in the aqua color. They really help people to understand their relationship to the person at the top of the chart. Is it my fourth great-grandfather, my fifth great-grandfather? If you click the Insert Image icon, then you can choose graphic images to insert on the chart. I created these 4 image files using Canva. Then I use this feature to insert them into the chart. Once inserted, you can scale them to a different size and freely move them about to the placement that you want. These graphics do a lot to make the chart more interesting and meaningful. The box, border, and line options give you control over the lines and shading of boxes. You can also control the color and the weight of the lines connecting the boxes. By default, females will have a pink box border and males will have a blue box border, and I left that as it was. The marked boxes 1, 2, and 3 are how I created those shaded boxes in the chart. You can select or multi-select boxes on the chart and flag them for one of these marked boxes. Then you pick the border style and shading for the 3 box types, and the marked boxes on your chart will take on these selected lines and shadings. The result of this are those colored boxes on the chart. Gray indicates direct lineage down to generation 6. Yellow is direct lineage in generation 7, and green direct lineage in generation 8. You get the full picture here with the lines and shadings that I've added for clarity. The gray boxes help you navigate easily through those early generations by direct line. The yellow boxes indicate my parents' level in the genealogy chart, and the green boxes indicate the level of myself and my first cousins. Without this feature, the chart is really challenging to follow and understand. I wanted people attending the reunion to interact with the chart and find their place in the family. So I used the Acadian star, which features prominently in the flags of Acadia and Acadiana for this. The gold star represents the patroness of the Acadian people, Our Lady of the Assumption. There were sheets of gold star stickers available along the front of the chart with this note asking everyone to place a star in their box. So these stars, first of all, gave everyone an idea of who was at the reunion, and secondly, became a permanent record of who was at the reunion. Almost everyone who came to the reunion went to Cedar Hill Cemetery. I wanted to provide them with some resources that would help them to connect the people they learned about in the exhibits with those buried at Cedar Hill. The first of these was a cemetery map. This was a 2-sided page. It had directions to the cemetery on one side, including notations where they should park. And it also shows where the Boudreau plot is located in relation to the main entrance. On the reverse side was a map of the Boudreau graves. Such a map had never before existed. A few weeks before the reunion, my wife Louise and I and one of my first cousins went out there with a tape measure, and we actually measured every grave and every distance between graves. And from that, I created this map. The dark graves at the bottom are Dr. Boudreau's original cemetery plot. These all have concrete slabs. The graves at the top feature granite headstones only, with the dotted line to indicate the full grave location. This is the plot section that my grandfather added. The second resource I prepared was an 11 by 17-inch 4-page brochure called Who's Who in Cedar Hill Cemetery. For each grave, I included the grave number from the map, a photograph of available birth and death dates, parents and children of the deceased, and one or two interesting facts about them, their occupation, a favorite hobby, a special accomplishment, military service, or perhaps cause of death. My hope was to help participants appreciate that these grave markers serve to mark a life, a person, a loved one. I began with the question, what's a genealogist to do? How to pass on all that hard work? I went into building a genealogy, and I showed you how I did that at our family reunion. But I also wanted to share this wealth of family information in a more tangible way. I did this by preparing 50 USB flash drives for participants to take home with them. The sign that was left was displayed on this table, itemizing the contents of the drives. Everything they saw at the reunion, plus quite a bit more, was included on these flash drives. Most files were in PDF format to make them easily accessible. You just never know who's going to be inspired to pick up the family history next. So on the USB drives were the 4 history and culture displays that I showed you, the 12 ancestor profiles, the Cedar Hill Cemetery map, the Who's Who in Cedar Hill Cemetery brochure, a full descendant chart from Dr. William Ralph Boudreau, a 48-page genealogy report of all the descendants of Augustin Remi Boudreau, and that simple 4-generation genealogy chart from Dr. Boudreau. Finally, the memories and tributes, which is where we began this presentation, those recent ancestors that we had stories to tell. And also a copy of my mother's memoir, the 372-page memoir, the first half of which is largely about stories of her ancestors. Well, that's what this genealogist did, to share his genealogy with his Boudreau cousins. I hope some of you will be inspired to do the same one day. Thank you for your attention.
Well, why don't we have some time for questions, and so thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, it's amazing to see all the detail that you have brought here tonight, but then also to see it up close on the screen is really terrific. So we appreciate that. So we can open it up for questions, and then if you all on Zoom, if you want to ask a question, please just hit the raise hand button, and we'll call on you then. But Casey, why don't you go ahead?
Sir.
Did you get any grief from the printers?
Well, you mean like at Office Depot? Office Depot was set up to do large format printing. What I learned is that you have to ask for what they are used to giving. So if they have a 36 by 24 inch poster, that's a great size to say, would you print this 36 by 24 inch poster for me? But if you say, I want this 38 by 23, no.
So what I'm getting at is many times printers will give you trouble over copyright.
Oh, no, I never got that. Never got a copyright. I'm sorry. The question for Zoom was the copyright issue. Did anybody give me grief about that? And nobody did.
You got an ISBN number for your mother's book?
The question for Zoom people, is there an ISBN for my mother's book? No, there is not, sadly. I actually bound those myself. So it was a private binding. I made 19 copies for her.
Could I ask a question from Zoom?
Question from Zoom, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I am your second cousin. Our parents were good friends. I mean, you know, but I always remember hearing of. So, are you going to help? And we'll do something like this for the Delery family.
Well, I will tell you. What is your name first?
I'm Wendy Delery Hills. My father was Oliver Delery.
Okay, Wendy. So my great grandmother or rather my grandmother was a Delery, my
Right.
father's mother.
Mother, right.
And my mother actually did do some work on the Delery line as well as the Ganucheau line and her own Boudreau line. So that would be fun.
Well, I got your email address, and so I'm gonna send you an email so we can connect. Cause I
That would
would
be
love
great.
to, you know, establish a relationship with cousins I didn't
Okay.
know.
Thank you. I have another cousin here in the audience, Glenn Ganucheau came tonight.
Yes,
This is awesome.
on the.
Two ones. Go cousins.
Donna?
Yes, ma'am.
So I saw you had a couple of the USB drives in here.
Yes,
I don't want to take one, but I'd love a copy of one.
you can take one.
You have
You
to
take
say.
one.
I mean,
Not everybody.
share it,
I have a few left, and those are the few that I have left, but you certainly may have.
because I see there's a few names. I'm on the Creole French side.
Okay.
However, I saw at least 3 names that look familiar to me, and I wonder, for example, the Labbé name.
Yes.
Have you gone backwards on that?
Again, this is my mother's genealogy, and yes, she did. The Labbé was on her mother's side, and she did go back on that. She actually prepared one of these genealogy fan charts for us with both sides of the family and all 4 branches going out about 5 or 6 generations.
I love the fan chart. It really helps me to see what holes I need to
Right,
fill.
it's a great visual.
Yeah.
You're right, yeah. So yes, you may have one, just for participation credit. Go ahead.
Still, you know how the Zwegs in Germany became Labranche.
LeBlanc, yep.
Became Labranche. Did you come across any interesting
Yeah,
adaptation?
that's the most interesting one, I have to tell you. It seems like there was another one, Glenn, but man, I just cannot for the life of me think of what it. I thought the Peters to Pete thing was very interesting. I learned that myself doing this research.
How do they say their name?
Pete.
Really?
Oh, yeah, Pete. Pete is Pete, P-I-T-R-E is Pete. But I had no idea it was Scottish, and Nova Scotia knew Scotland. That's where that came from. And the Acadians always called it Acadie, by the way. I forgot to mention that. They never called it Nova Scotia. It was Acadie.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Let me ask on Zoom if there are other questions.
Yeah, Zoom land, any other questions?
You all
Raise your hand.
just unmute if you want to
Yeah,
ask a
just
question.
on mute, yep. Maybe not.
One question I had, Bill, was when you got you said you got 400-word stories from your relatives. Did you check that against your genealogy, or how much work did you do to kind of verify?
I did no work to verify. If my cousin says, this is my dad's life, I'm gonna take her at her word. In other words, they didn't do genealogy. They just said, this is what dad loved to do. This is what was his occupation. This is what he did during the war. Maybe this is how he died. You know, it's those kinds of things that they were giving me, not going back, doing any kind of genealogy work. So I really literally, a couple times I made a few corrections that were necessary in terms of the English language. But other than that, I really wanted to let it be what it was, with how they wrote it, you know. Yes, sir.
Did they use writing, or did they just give you facts and you wrote it?
Almost all of them wrote the story out. One of them said, look, I'm not a great writer. Here's the stuff, and you write it. And I did, and then sent it to him to make sure it was okay, you know. But everybody else wrote the stories. It was some tooth pulling. I mean, I really had to stay after him. I started this in January. That's when we finally pulled the trigger and rented the hall. So that's when I started doing all this. And that was one of the first things I wanted to do, was get these stories. I knew it would take time. You know, people aren't used to writing like that, you know, but they did a great job. They really did. Yes,
Did
Glenn.
you come through a lot of conflicts of information where they were in conflict, like, no, that wasn't his son's name, or no, that wasn't the date of death, or
You know,
you didn't see a
I
lot?
didn't see that, because again, they weren't, I had the genealogy. In fact, I gave them the top part of that chart that shows who their parents were, who their children are. So they had that, and they knew that was gonna be on the
Well,
form.
I understand when you're in ancestry.com or something, there's a lot of contributors.
Oh, yeah.
They overlap and not all agree.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So you can't take that.
How is that,
Yeah. I really didn't use that resource, and I don't think my mother used it very much at all. She basically went for the records, and
listen to mom.
and there is a lot, obviously, of stuff that's not correct, on the online ancestry stuff, but yes, ma'am.
So they stay spelled that way, the whole.
Well,
Michelle is not.
It's interesting, Michel's wife was Michel with two L's. So Michel married Michel in France, and then they came to but their name is Boudrot. Now, there's lots of different names, obviously. But I would say certainly from the time of his grandson, this Augustin Remi, it remained Boudrou. Now, there's lots of Eaux Boudreaux in Louisiana. Don't get me wrong. They're just not our relatives. They come from a different line. So, I didn't run into, but there's at least one or two other spellings of Boudreau too, Michelle.
My ancestors use Boudro.
Oh, yeah.
Another famous restaurant.
So people in Zoom land were talking about Boudreau name variations is what the discussion, I'm sorry, is going on here. I forgot to click go in. That Michelle was asking that question. Anything else?
Did you have any interesting reactions from the youngest generations who were there?
I have to fess up here. I didn't go to the reunion. I worked on this for 4 months. I was loading up the van Friday night to drive on Saturday morning to Washington, and I started feeling weak. I tested positive for COVID that night, and I couldn't go. So one of my cousins drove the van up, and my wonderful wife sat up for 2 hours with me, writing detailed instructions how to set up each display. And they set them all up and sent pictures and zoomed me in during the day, but I was not able. So I really don't have firsthand information about reactions,
Well, I did something very rudimentary to what you did, but we had our family reunion in 2019. And I had fan charts, I had list of all the names and the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren, so that I could help explain first cousin, second cousin, once removed, all of that.
right?
And I thought I might only speak for 30 minutes. It ended up being 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And nobody moved an inch. They were riveted. So I felt so bad that you didn't experience that, because it was just, everybody was just soaking up every word.
Yeah.
Of course, I loved it.
Yeah.
But, well, I hope you get a chance to do it.
No, I really got amazing feedback from my cousins during the day, texting and phoning and sending pictures, and they were wonderful, they appreciated it so much.
Delery reunion.
Yeah, maybe so. You heard that, the Delery.
Who was that?
Who was that?
Oh, Donna Goche.
Donna Goche. That was Donna Goche talking about maybe do that at the Delery reunion, she said.
Hey, I've got a whole bunch of stuff I just found of my parent when my mother died last year, and we were cleaning out the house, and I found some stuff I didn't even realize I had, like letters in French by various Delery ancestors, and the title to the Perot tomb where my grandfather Louis Delery is buried, and I'm getting ready to get that renovated because it's in deplorable shape all of a sudden. So I've got tons of interesting stuff, but I remember mom and dad talking of your parents, and remembering when your dad died and everything, hearing that.
Yeah,
so it would be fun for me to get to know you.
Well, do email me.
I
Thank
will.
you. So Stephen, I don't want to go over.
Okay, well, I think, are there any other questions, from the audience? And anyone else on Zoom, would you like to ask a question before we close out?
Just a quickie question. What was the, how long did it take from when you sent your chart to be printed at ancestry.com, at Ancestry Printing, to when you received it?
So the question is, how long did it take from when I sent the chart to be printed to when I received it back? I actually talked to the proprietor several times over the course of about 3 weeks, and he gave me lots of good tips. He knew this software program backwards and forwards. And so I went back and changed some things so that it would work better. By the time I was ready to upload it, to the time I got it back, it was maybe a week.
Oh, okay.
I mean, he does this for a living, and he started it because he was so frustrated trying to get a commercial printer to print his genealogy chart for him, because they're not prepared to do that. I wasn't about to send this to Office Depot and
that's
forget
this chart,
it.
right?
That's this chart. Yeah. So about a week between the time he got it and the time I got it back. Yeah, it was excellent service.
What the dimensions are?
It's 22 feet long and 24 inches wide.
One continuous.
One continuous piece. Yeah.
Post reunion, did they help you fill in some spots?
I didn't get much post reunion, no. I tried to do that in advance so that I could include all the new births and all that on the chart. I didn't want to leave people out, so I really tried to encourage people. I would send each family, this is what I have. Tell me who's new, you know. So I didn't get a lot of feedback of new or mistakes or anything like that.
That was smart to have a form so people weren't whipping out pens.
Right. I didn't want them writing on my chart.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you so much.
You are most welcome.